Hi, it's Glenn Mulcahy, your host for Love of the Game summits, webinars, and now live streams. I'm super excited. We've adopted a new platform, and I'm really excited to have our first of what I aspire to be weekly live stream chats with amazing people in the space. Today, we're with Steve Boyle, the founder of 241 Sports, and he's a former Division I basketball player. Also played a whole bunch of other sports, school counselor over 20 years, and the founder of 241 Sports. He's also advisory chair for the National Association of Physical Literacy, and I'll get him to kind of fill in a little bit more of the blanks. Steve, thanks for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
Absolutely, Glenn. I'm thrilled that you've had me on. I love this platform, and always love having a conversation with you, even though it's morning time for you and afternoon for me. It's great to be connected.
Yeah, every time we did our weekly calls for planning the New West camp, good morning, good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, because of the time zone difference. So yeah, looking forward to having a great chat. So for people that don't know the work that you've been doing for over a decade now, maybe give us a little bit of background story in terms of what led you up to founding 241 Sports, and then we can kind of do a deep dive in physical literacy, multisport, et cetera, et cetera.
For sure. And again, it's a story that when I first started telling, it felt very, very new and very fresh, but it started with my now 24-year-old when she was 9. So believe it or not, it's 15 years ago that this incident happened. And it's, as we start to share it locally, nationally, and globally, it resonates with so many people even today because of just how prevalent the problem still seems to be. And so as much as we're working towards trying to create change, we have found that the only way to do that is through local communities. And case in point with you all out in Vancouver and New Westminster. But so when Alana, who's our oldest daughter now, was 9 years old, she tried out for the local travel soccer team. And Carrie and I both being coaches in town and having younger children, we just didn't want our oldest kid to stink at stuff, right? You just kind of hope that they go and they're going to have a good, positive experience. Well, we get the call from the travel soccer coach that our 9-year-old is his number one prospect. And I'm like, dude, she's 9 years old. How she's anybody's prospect? And when I look back on it now, it's even more insane than it felt then. And no, granted, we were, oldest child, first-time parents. We want to make sure that, it felt good to know our kid was good. But at the same time, we just thought it was a little overkill. So after about 20 minutes of how she's going to fit into the Brazilian style of play, I finally said, well, look, my wife, Carrie, coaches lacrosse, and she played lacrosse in college. And Alana's showing some early interest in lacrosse and wants to try it in the spring. And as a soccer coach, I always thought of soccer as a fall sport. And I said, but it looks like there could be a conflict for the spring. Can you tell us what the conflict will be like if she plays lacrosse as well as does your travel soccer program? He gets this angry tone, and all of a sudden says, hold on a second. As if he's going to go talk to the guy in the back of the car dealership. And he comes back 20 seconds later and says, we're no longer interested in your daughter. So went from number one prospect to no longer interested simply because as a 9-year-old, she showed interest in playing another sport. So I had some choice words that I won't repeat for the young folks.
This is a family broadcast.
And that night I said to Carrie, look, we could shout from the mountaintops or we could infiltrate and do something about it. So we came up with the tagline, life's too short for just one sport. And actually that summer started planning for the following year, a camp that we called Boyle's 3-Season Sports Academy. Because our initial thought was, let's bring back the 3-season athlete, right? Because we were finding this was what was happening. You didn't have kids who played more than one sport. So Carrie was an athletic director at a private school. We did just for girls because we had 3 daughters. That was the local market that we knew. But moms and dads were showing up holding the hands of their sons when they were dropping their daughters off and said, hey, will you do this for the boys next year? And we said, absolutely, as long as you promise to send them. And within 2 years, we outgrew the facility we're at because we had 2.5 days of straight rain and one gymnasium with 104 boys. And we were like, all right, we got it. We need a bigger place. And before we knew it, we had gotten a call about 4 years later from Tom Ferry at Project Play in the Aspen Institute and said, he goes, would you mind if we recognize you as one of 8 model programs in the United States? And I was like, mind? Absolutely not. And so that really is what allowed us to become part of the national conversation around what we didn't even know was a term when we started 241 Sports, but that is on physical literacy development. So we realized that of the 8 plays at Project Play, sports sampling was one of the key plays. But in order to develop physical literacy, sports sampling is a key and core component, especially in the early years as it relates to physical literacy development. And then I kind of knew this was my life's work, right? I had been a teacher, coach, and then a counselor for all those years. But this was the thing that married all the work I'd been doing up to that point. And so after, maybe about another 5 years, I just left my job as a public high school counselor and coach and pursued this avenue of really advocating for physical literacy development, long-term athlete development, and sports sampling programs around, at that time around America, around the United States, but now with you all in Canada, and then doing some programming in places like Australia and China, which has just been, a thrill.
Kind of an amazing journey in terms of the growth, and it's kind of the for me 3 years ago, it's ironic, the kickstart for where we're at is when I contributed along with a few others to an article that was in the Vancouver Sun, and it went viral worldwide. The digital edition, it kind of blew my mind. We were watching our Facebook page, just absolutely blew up. Yeah. And it was in direct response to an article I saw in January where they were highlighting and focusing on the importance of specialization. And I immediately went to the editor of the sports section and said, hey, whoa. There's two sides of the story, which we've had numerous conversations with. And when I bombarded him with like multiple emails, he finally caved. He said, you know what, I got to write about this side. And the multisport versus the early specialization has been forever a hot topic. But let's go back in time. When did you really start seeing it blow up in the US? Because I can kind of shed some insight in Canada. What was your daughter, but was it before that? And how far back in time, what led to where we're at now?
Yeah, I do think, soccer gets the worst rap, right? And certainly the term soccer mom started in the early 90s. And there was this feeling of, I got to get my kid into soccer. And then there was this feeling of specialization. And it just sort of happened suddenly. I mean, I had gotten my start teaching on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I didn't experience with inner city kids quite as much, except what I did see was there was a fear of failure from the kids I was trying to encourage to come out for basketball. I was at a high school that turned out, Ron Artest, Shamgod Wells, who changed his name to God Shamgod when he got to the NBA. Different NBA players they would compete against. So what we were seeing was a decline in the number of kids who were coming out for a sport because they were afraid of the disparity. All right. And this was before YouTube and Snapchat, where kids were worried about, things happening virally to them and then showing themselves getting their ankles broken on a crossover dribble or getting dunked on. But that was the first time I saw it, but I didn't really think too much about it. Then I got out to Seattle and I started for the first time to hear about these travel programs. I grew up in an era where, I don't think of myself as that old, right? I mean, I was playing into the late 80s, and then a lot of my teammates played into the early 90s, which for young people might feel like an eternity ago, but I think for a lot of parents doesn't feel like that long ago. And it was right on the cusp there that some of the people I was playing against were in the AAU world. Well, AAU then turned into travel and elite soccer programs, and then travel and elite lacrosse programs, year-round hockey programs. And I think in the mid-90s to mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, that's where we just started to see sort of the business of sport really blow up in a way where people were making parents fearful of their kid missing out on athlete development if they didn't specialize. And I wish I could tell you, there was a tipping point for me. It was all anecdotal. It was anecdotal either as a coach, as a counselor, or as a parent. And, and as a college advisor too, because that was one of my other jobs, was just talking with college coaches about the recruiting process and just how insane it had gotten with them offering, full rides to kids in the 8th grade for soccer or lacrosse, before they even had fully grown or developed. I mean, just absolute insanity during that decade.
Yeah, and I remember seeing, and I shared it in a lot of talks I've done. Probably the youngest I saw get offered a full ride scholarship was a kid. He was 9 years old in a football program in Los Angeles. It was offered to him by Las Vegas University, and I was like beside myself. And about 2 years later, NCAA finally revamped their recruitment rules because they were taking a lot of heat. That the joke that a lot of people are saying, well, they're starting to recruit them when they're born, or literally in the cradle, and it's just getting insane. So fortunately, they've changed the rules. I think they can't start the recruiting process until the kids are 15. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It still varies sport by sport, right? And so they've gotten some sanity around some of it. So part of it is the college admissions process has moved up, and so the NCAA is finally caught up with that. So now probably 60% of all kids who apply to colleges that are selective, in other words, they accept some kids and not others, are applying by November 1st, either early action or early decision. Well, and then the college coaches were sort of, I don't want to say bullying, but it was to their advantage to have kids apply early. Well, if you couldn't do your official visits until fall of your senior year, well, then you've got 3 weeks to decide where you're going to go spend the next 4 years of your life. So the NCAA has caught up a little bit, but now with COVID, there's been some new changes and restrictions. So trying to stay on top of that, remains a pretty significant challenge. But, to your point, I remember I was coaching a girls' high school lacrosse team going down to Greenwich, Connecticut, which is known as a powerhouse for girls lacrosse. And the best player on the team is a freshman. She'd already committed to the University of North Carolina. And I'm thinking to myself, how do you coach a kid like that in high school when they already know where they're going to college? So even from obviously you want to do things that are going to motivate kids. And so you have to approach things much differently as a high school coach if your players have already committed and might be getting external pressure from those college coaches saying, don't you get hurt. Don't you play basketball during basketball season because you've committed to the University of North Carolina to play lacrosse, where I know that kid playing basketball is actually going to keep her from getting hurt when she comes out to play lacrosse. And again, the challenge for me has been taking what I knew sort of instinctively, sort of, qualitative stuff, and then looking to quantify it based on the research that's out there. And look, I know there's some pro specialist folks out there, and they have their arguments. But what I think happens there is it creates exception thinking. And you start to think, well, if everybody else is doing that multi-sport thing like Steve's advocating for, my kid's going to be the next Tiger Woods. And again, that's what I consider exception thinking when you look at things that way.
Yeah, if you look at probably the best and number one book reference I recommend coaches, parents, everybody in the space is David Epstein's Range.
Absolutely.
And when that came out, it literally exploded. And I remember I was doing a summit and I was interviewing John Kessel for one of the recorded interviews. And he's showing me everything in his office when he was with USA Volleyball, all the trinkets he accumulated over 30 years. And then he pulls out the book. Look what I got. Like right off the presses. And as soon after I got it. And the first chapter is all about Tiger Woods versus Roger Federer. And Roger Federer's path was he played everything under the sun. You name it, he played it. And he loved his whole path. And he's still competing, even in his 30s now, without a lot of injuries. And then you look at Tiger Woods and all the injuries he sustained. Yeah, he had his first 10 years were amazing, right? He hit the tour in his 20s. He went on this amazing round. But once he got to his 30s, look at all the injuries sustained on the left side of his body because of the torque of his golf swing. And the last one he had before he won the tour championship, that back fusion. And when he did it, it was merely to help him walk again, not necessarily compete again. And I remember watching that tour, and he's walking down and thousands of people when he won the event. It was a big milestone for him, but 10 years of injuries. Yeah. And that's what a lot of people keep missing the boat is the more you do the overuse in a sport, the potential that you're not going to have a long career. So I can't believe how many people think it's okay to go 10 months a year in kids working sports at such a young age.
Yeah, look, I mean, at the end of the day, there's so few of the kids that we come in contact with that are going to go professional, never mind collegiate or even varsity high school, right? So our goal and our dream for them should be to be healthy, active adults when they grow up, that they have a love of sport, that they have an understanding of the game, that they could go to the local park and know how to play tennis or small-sided soccer or anything where they can have fun with their friends, their children, and their grandchildren. And when I say their grandchildren, I mean literally when you're in your 60s and your 70s, you should be so crippled from early year sports that you can't be a lifelong mover and athlete and enjoying participation at some level. So, yeah, I too advocate for the book Range. David Epstein is actually a fellow New York City walk-on. I don't know if folks know that he walked on to the University of Columbia's cross-country team and actually became their #1 runner by the time he was a senior. So as somebody who walked on in the Bronx, I'm always trying to connect with David on that. And hopefully he and I will share a walk-on book someday.
Yeah, well, if you can ever track him down, because he's probably one of the most interviewed guys on the planet. One of my most memorable that he did was with Malcolm Gladwell. I think it was for MIT, and then there was a few other ones that happened after that. Yeah. And I recently shared it with someone. A coach forwarded me an article. It was written by a gentleman who contributed to CNBC, Kumar Mehta, I think his name is, and wrote a book called The Exceptionals. Mm-hmm. And his argument was, in order to become exceptional, you have to specialize early. So, of course, it was like that Vancouver Sun article. I jumped all over it. We exchanged a couple of emails, said, hey, read the book Range. But the irony is the 3 references he gave as good examples: Tiger Woods, Andrew Agassi, and Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours. So everybody knows now that Malcolm has reneged and said, hey, I was wrong when I wrote that theory about the 10,000 hour rule. There's a whole bunch of variables that come into play. Tiger Woods with all the injuries sustained. And I don't know if have you ever read the book Open by Andrew Agassi? Yeah. In that book, he comes out and says, I hated my life growing up because all I did was tennis. He became an amazing tennis player, but then he started suffering major depression near the end of his career because he never had a normal childhood. And that's my biggest thing with the fact that kids are focusing too early. They're being deprived of not only finding the sport they potentially fall in love with, like, 'cause I fell in love with rugby late because I didn't start playing until I was 15. Yeah. But it's also being deprived of all the other stuff: band, art, music, drama, computer science, robotics, all the other activities. Because if you go hard early, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, sport becomes a work experience. You don't have the time to do all that stuff. So how does your kid become well-rounded?
Exactly. And I think that's, one of the things that's happening right now. And I do hope that when we sort of come out on the other side of the shutdowns and the lockdowns the way we've had them, is that we overstructure kids to a point. Now, one example I'll often give is that when I look back, when I do some public speaking and I'll run a workshop, one of the first activities I'll do as an icebreaker is to ask people to share with a partner what's their favorite memory of themselves as a child at play. And the laughter that happens in those conversations is just that alone says something to you about it. But then I'll ask, all right, for how many of you was there an adult involved in that memory? And 95 to 99% of the time, there's never an adult involved with one's favorite memory of themselves as a child at play. And I thought when I got to do it with college kids, that would be the same. It wouldn't be the same. They might talk about coaches, and no, it's still the same thing. It's independent, creative experiences. And so what we've done is we've gotten into such a structured society that we've pulled the opportunity for exploration away. And a lot of times parents will say, well, my kid loves soccer. Well, they don't love soccer. They love pleasing you, right? And you took them to soccer, and because you tell them how good they are at it, that feels good. Like, how do you know if they don't love something else unless you give them the opportunity to try that? So, talk about op-eds. I'm in the middle of writing one right now that I hope gets some legs, because one of the things we're finding is that the stimulus money has sort of awoken people to say, okay, how do we spend money at the municipality level, at the local level, to do programming that's going to be impactful? But they're doing it sort of backwards by saying, all right, we're giving you this giant bucket of money, but you have to spend it by the end of 2022. So what I want to do is make sure that they're using the funds in a way that's going to be lasting and self-sustaining. And Glenn, I got to tell you, the place where that can happen are in our schools, right? Why are we sending kids home from 3 to 5 p.m. on a daily basis, right? As a school counselor, you know when I worried about kids? From 3 to 5 p.m. You got either single parents or 2 working parents. You're sending kids home with an electronic device. I can search anything on here, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and it's going to show up right up on my phone right away, right? And then I'm going to be playing my video games. And if I get bored, you know how I get less bored? I might experiment with drugs and alcohol. Now, look, I realize I'm overstating some things, but honest to God, why, when we have kids at our schools, why are we sending them home in hopes that maybe they've got enough money to go for the travel program? Maybe they've got enough wherewithal to go to what in many cases a poorly run rec program, right? Or they might have apathetic parents who are like, I don't care. So to your point, why aren't we turning our schools, especially our middle schools, into rec centers? The kids are there. So let's use the funding that we have to create. And it doesn't have to be just sports sampling. Obviously, that would be my druthers. But when we do sports sampling, when we have groove and move at some of our camps, which is an introduction to dance or cheer, right? There's other, we'll offer yoga. There are other movement-based activities that could be intramural offerings. And you can do it before school as well. So I think as we look to try to solve some of these societal issues around, anxiety and depression increase, drug and alcohol increase, addiction to sex and drugs, like those things that happen at developmental stages, we can counteract that through proper programming. And now that there's some funding becoming available to do those things, to me, it seems like such a simple solution, but getting people to have the courage to act on it is yet another thing.
Yeah, and one of the biggest challenges too in the school system, and it kills me when I think of this, there's no phys ed specialists anymore in the elementary system. So, we've been having dialogue with several organizations saying, how can we get our programming into pre and post school and even during school hours? And I'm like, what do you mean? Well, we don't have any phys ed. We don't have any teachers that can teach this. I mean, right. that to me is unfortunate. And it's a lot part of it is because of lack of funding and kind of reallocation of resources, not towards physical activity or art or dance or drama or band in lieu academics, because we want to focus on that, which is important. But how do you become well-rounded? Like I've always been that big believer, sound mind, sound body, and vice versa, right?
Absolutely. Again, this is my educator hat, but it's my parent hat, and it's a me hat. Like my anxiety level starts to go through the roof on the days that I'm not able to get my workout in. And that's always been the case. I'd have middle school kids come into my office again because the teacher sent them out and the principal said, well, go see your counselor. And I'd say to the kids, well, what's wrong? He goes, I don't know. I just feel like I have to move all the time. And I would look at the kid and say, that's because you do have to move all the time. So here I am trying to then fight with the teacher to say, look, can't you do some things to help this kid get moving? That the kid doesn't have any recess. They've developed a schedule where he gets physical education for 3 weeks straight at a time, but then doesn't get any physical education for 6 weeks. So missing the whole point of what daily physical activity would do for them. So we've structured our schools in such a way where we've pulled physical education, we've pulled recess, and now we're not doing any after-school activity programming like intramural sports. And we wonder why these kids are turning to medication for attention deficit, for anxiety, for depression, or self-medicating just to have an enjoyable time. And it's dumbfounding. It's frustrating. It's almost immoral as far as I'm concerned. Because look, I'm all about the need for academic stuff, but there's so much research out there that says they're going to get more out of their academic experience if we get their body moving. So we get blood flow to the brain, they'll retain it better, they'll perform better, they'll be more engaged. I mean, come on, guys. But here's an opportunity, Glenn. It is right in front of us right now to change things a little bit. But to to the point that you and I often make, it's one thing to talk at 30,000 feet. It's another thing to create change at local level, and because that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, and ultimately, in order for that to happen, you need champions at that level bring it to the forefront, right? One of the saddest statistics that I came across, it was when we did our first 4 summits were pre-recorded interviews. So last July, we went to the let's do recorded plus a live event for 3 days. We had a live conference, and one of the panels we had the coordinator for the Memphis Junior, Shayla, who is no longer with them. The Memphis Junior Grizzlies has a program where they're teaching basketball, rugby, and I think they were introducing baseball. But the video that they shared just blew my mind. In Memphis, the minimum required physical activity in the schools was 20 minutes a week. I was like beside myself. I'm like,
such a joke. It's a joke.
Should be like at least 20 minutes a day, if not an hour a day, like it used to be when we grew up. Like we had phys ed as part of all the way to grade 12. And then when they started pulling that out, it was like, what do you, and then the shift is to the academies where all the schools are going down a special route. But I don't know, that just blew my mind. And that's where we have so much work to do, ensure to bring back the kids. So just seeing some comments coming in. You may know a Charles Caleri. Valid point.
I know Charlie well. So I asked my wife to marry me at a camp for children with cancer called Happiness is Camping, and Charlie was the camp director my first year when I was volunteer coordinator. And then, but he and I, he's 5 years older than I am, but we're both Manhattan College Jasper grads. So after he graduated, I moved into this cool dorm that we both shared it. So how you doing, Charlie? Thanks for tuning in.
There you go. Got comments, and Mr. Lenahan, who's our director for the camp in New West, quote unquote, hyperspecialization makes you miss other sports and activities, but also friendships, family events, and other simple joys in life. And I think he's nailing it on the head, because when a kid is going, like I remember probably the worst year, and the reason why I became such an advocate for this, my son was invited to do a spring hockey and summer hockey and all this other stuff, and we finally said, enough is enough. Let's just go hockey for winter season, 8 months, then rugby in the summer, and then golf in the it's blah blah blah. And then he became much happier. Like when it's just one sport, it's too much, totally too much.
Yeah, well, for sure. And two things, and one will I'll allude to Charlie. The first thing to Jeff's point. Like and I've always said this, I was probably better at soccer than I was at basketball, but I just like basketball better. But I often will say the best thing about me playing soccer was it helped me to miss basketball. Wayne Gretzky's known to be saying, like, when hockey season was over, I couldn't wait to hang up the skates and pick up the lacrosse stick and play other things. And there is something about the absence makes the heart grow fonder. Like if I was playing AAU basketball from the time I was 11, like a lot of these kids do, until I was a senior in high school, I would have been like, are you kidding me? There's no way I want to do this now for my job in college. So these kids that are playing, 100 games a year with referees and screaming coaches and parents on the sideline, it's a resilient kid that, and it's one reason why you get to some of these programs. And, soccer or lacrosse, for example, will often at the Division I, II, or III level have 13 or 14 freshmen and 3 or 4 seniors across the board. In every sport, in every program, this is a pretty normal phenomenon because the coaches are recruiting attrition. They're basically saying these kids are either going to psychologically or physically burn out, so we have to heavily recruit and even get preferred walk-ons to then to help us fill a roster in hopes that we can get 3 or 4 of them to make it to senior day. And that in and of itself says, well, this is a horrible experience. But, back to Happiness is Camping. I asked Carrie to marry me there, and it remains just a really special place in my history. But it was probably most special because it was really where I realized the value of play and summer experiences. I mean, we would visit kids during the school year at Memorial Sloan Kettering that would say to us, I'm going through my chemo treatment right now because I can't wait for camp. They were saying to us, we are literally living for our summer camp experience. And then you'd get there and you'd see, at that time, as opposed to treating the tumors the way they do now, they would literally just take the limb. It was just an easier, safer experience. So you'd have a lot of kids with one leg, sometimes no legs or no arm. And then all the girls would, for the first time, would be willing to take off their wigs because there were 7 or 8 other bald girls there. And to watch them interact with each other and play, that I didn't know it at the time, but it was really sort of seeding something for me in terms of how important it is to get kids active and how life-giving it is, literally life-giving for kids to have play-filled summer experiences. And to this day, there's a reunion coming up this summer that's being promoted right now. These kids still talk about how much a camp like that changed their lives and maybe saved their lives.
Yeah, the whole infamous, aspiring to make a difference, making a living, and hopefully we can all get there and do it. But there's nothing better than when you see a kid smile when they're dealing with a lot of adversity and they're coming out of that. So kudos to you for putting that on. It's I have a similar experience, not necessarily on a sport camp, but I was involved, and hopefully they'll be able to resurrect. I sponsored a charity called Dreams Take Flight for over 20 years. So my prior hat with, the workplace, whatever the case may be. And they would fly kids down to Disneyland for a day. It was literally a 24-hour marathon. We get up at 2:00 in the morning. We go to the airport. We fly down to LA. We do Disneyland like for 10 hours. It's like 20,000 steps, then back to the airport and back home.
Yeah.
But I'll remember to this day, the very first flight that I had an opportunity to go on, where we were on the bus with all the kids from Children's Hospital and many of them from the oncology ward. And they would bring them off the bus in their wheelchairs, and they had respirators and a whole bunch of stuff. And they will never forget watching these kids that were being brought to the gate. And we arranged for Mickey and Minnie to greet them as they entered into the park. And the smiles on their faces was unbelievable. And the tears in our eyes was unbelievable. And hopefully I can hold the floodgates back, because that's what it's all about, is the smiles on the kids' faces.
Absolutely.
And when I see kids that are specializing by 11, 12, 13 years old, and all the years I coached, I see the smiles going away, because there's no longer, they're not playing because they love it. They're not playing because they're with their buddies. They're playing because they have to. And that's just wrong in my eyes.
Yeah, look, we could talk about all the sort of broken pieces, but what I can tell you is that, even tryout situations at the high school level, I was always drawn to the multi-sport athletes, not because it was my thing. There was just a different charisma about them. They had a joy and a natural competitiveness about them there was a confidence that was just different. And when the specialist would show up, they were performers. They were like dancers, right? And they would, like soccer would be a perfect example. You could show up, you could do a Maradona, you could juggle 63 times, you could, do all these tricks. But when it came down to hunting down a loose ball, there was little effort. There wasn't this feeling of, I got to get to that loose 50-50 ball, because that's what competitors do. And I just, again, that's anecdotal and more qualitative. But to your point, they were the fun kids to coach. The specialist was something about, oh my God, this high school season this is boring compared to my elite travel
the club team
and God season. And to me, that's one of the sad parts that's really happened through the specialization. So.
Yeah, we talk a little about the cons. Let's talk a little bit about the path of the multi-sport camps and the improvisation and adaption. So going back to last March, to get their basketball guy, where were you, and what was going through your mind when you heard the NBA was shutting down because of COVID, and then all the sports to follow suit the next 3 days?
Yeah, as somebody who doesn't always appreciate professional sports the way I do college athletics, I will tell you that I was constantly glued to any decisions that were being made around COVID. Now, having been consulting in China a little bit before, in the prior year, I was consulting to a school that had a shutdown about 3 months prior to the shutdown that happened in the United States. So I sort of saw some of it coming through my own experiences with consulting to that school. But once the major league programs started to shut down, I was like, holy cow, this is more serious than any of us could have thought.
Yeah.
And part of it is I had 2 children who were in college, one of whom was a college athlete whose season was just announced as over, and just lots of implications. And then all of a sudden it went to, well, my livelihood is running summer programming, but this is end of March. We'll be fine by the time June comes around. And there was this just rationalization that goes through your head of don't worry about it. And then as the days started to tick away and things seemed to be getting more serious, and we were seeing the deaths coming out of Italy, and then the worry about those amount of deaths happening in municipalities and cities in the United States, we then were waiting for guidance from the CDC because we wanted to be able to sort of say, okay, because our parents needed some level of communication. They had this fear, and then they were like looking at, what if I have to do this online school thing for more than 3 weeks? And then 3 weeks was turning into 3 months. So we needed to give a literal lifeline to some of these parents. And when the CDC finally came out with recommendations in mid-April, they were such a joke. In fact, it was probably later than that. I mean, it was as if they were written, well, I don't want to get political, but it was not what we were expecting to see. I mean, it was silly stuff like, we recommend that if a camper or staff person shows up feeling ill, that you not allow them to stay at camp. Like, you recommend that? I mean, that's the case in schools and camps forever and ever, pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So what we did is we took a look at what was available at the federal level, which wasn't a ton. Then what in Connecticut, which has pretty strict guidelines, because that's where we're based out of Connecticut, was let's look at what's coming out of the governor's office, the Department of Public Health, the Office of Early Childhood. And then based on that intel, let's just communicate clearly to families what we're going to do. And this was the big key, I think. Concussions were the big thing in sports over the last decade. And what we would say to folks, like, look, we can't guarantee you that your child's not going to get a concussion through this activity. What we can guarantee you is we're going to do everything based on the science to mitigate risk. So that's how we approach COVID. We can't guarantee that our staff or our campers aren't going to get COVID, but these are the things we're going to do to mitigate risk. And if you're still fearful, no questions asked. We're going to send your tuition back, or we're going to ask if you're able and you're in a financial position to do so, to defer that tuition to the following year. Conversely, we said to folks, if we are able to run programs and you've been negatively impacted financially by the crisis, you send your kid to camp, no questions asked. Pay us when you can. Because if we're going to sort of have this language of we're all in this together, well, then it can't be one way or the other. So by doing that, we wrote really clear guidelines. Kudos to Kingswood Oxford School and the administration there, Tom Dillo, the headmaster, Sherry Shea from their program who worked with us. They basically said, look, yeah, we've got to try out some of these protocols to see that when we open up our schools in the fall, are they going to work? What is it like for adults to wear masks for 24/7? How is it when we break kids into cohorts? Are they going to be able to stay away and not commingle? How hard is it to clean up after kids eating and using restrooms and all of those things? And we learned a lot through that process. By the time the fall came around, there was some really good data anecdotally for some of these schools to be able to do it. And the same thing, while we were doing that in Connecticut, we were working with you and Jeff based on what, British Columbia, the country of Canada, but locally what New Westminster was saying. And we did the exact same thing. We said to parents, this is what we're going to do. And we delivered on what we were going to do. And people felt confident in that because they knew we weren't promising something that we couldn't deliver on. All we could deliver on is what we promised, right? And I think that's what parents appreciate.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us is, and probably the business, it was that moving target. And when we'd have our weekly meetings, or bi-weekly meetings now, that Groundhog Day, well, you got any new news? No, it's pretty much the same. We're still kind of in. And then we've gone through the phases. So we had the phase 1, which was right at the beginning where everything was shut down. Then went to phase 2. We were fortunate we got to phase 3 where a lot of sports were starting to open up, and outdoor sports specifically. So we could do things that we couldn't do. But now, come back full circle, like 12 months later, we're back to full shutdown. In BC, I know Ontario, Quebec are literally shut down. My wife told me yesterday, well, we're not going away for the May long weekend because we can't travel anywhere. We literally can't even go out of zone, which is what's going to happen this summer. And where are you seeing things going to trend across the board? Because I know you got a lot of camps. You got a new one with Nate Baldwin coming up. So what are you thinking come this summer?
Actually, with Nate, we decided to bump it off to 2022 because the numbers at the time we needed to make a firm decision in Wisconsin were not great. So, but we will have 2 camps in Colorado where we're seeing things trend differently. We're running a funded program in Philadelphia. We will, and we have about 7 that we're set up to do here in Connecticut. So in Connecticut, we've done a really good job in terms of the vaccination schedule. And the governor just announced that basically all restrictions are going to be lifted as of May 20th. And which means the only thing that's going to sort of stay sort of local jurisdiction will be mask mandates indoors. But for the most part, full capacity for outdoor soccer games, for outdoor venues. In my opinion, it's probably a little too much, too early. But it's an indication that because we think 70 to 80% of the Connecticut population will be vaccinated, that we're in a position to start easing back into normal. I mean, I think part of what we're starting to realize is, first of all, the virus is less contagious on surfaces and on touch to touch, so that the washing down of the groceries was overkill, right?
Right.
And that outdoor contact with no mask is okay as long as you're not breathing and coughing and spitting on each other. You're okay. So in sports where that could potentially be a thing, and more so, I think, I talked about Italy before, and I think the real fear was the overflow in the hospitals and what could potentially happen from a death rate if we're not prepared for that. A year later, we have a better understanding of how to treat the disease, and I don't want to be one of those guys who says, well, it's the same as the flu, because it's not. But it does get to a point where we do have to say we can't keep doing this for the rest of our lives. And just like we have flu vaccines, we're probably going to have COVID variation vaccines over time. And our reaction to all this is going to have to be based on the science of the year. There might be some things we need to do year over year. And one year might be hey, no mask this year because it's not as contagious a variant. And this year might be, hey, we got to go super restrictive again and go back to a cohort model. So we're getting calls on the daily. Are we going back to our traditional model, which is where kids can choose sports and then we build a master schedule, and those kids then will cross over? If they go from basketball first session, they might go to lacrosse with some kids who were in soccer first session. Last year at all of our programs, what we did was we put kids into the allotted cohort size that area was saying was okay. In Connecticut, that was 12. So we had 18 cohorts of up to 12 kids, and they never interacted with any other cohort. They just traveled as a group from sport to sport. And when they got there, the adults stayed more than 6 feet away, always had masks on. We think we're going to be able to get to a point where we can do a choose your sport commingle model. But the issue with that is you can't do contact tracing. So we've got to then make sure that if we are going to that model, that our contact tracing protocols meet what the governmental standards are. And that is going to be different in Connecticut than it is in Colorado, than it is in New Westminster, and than it is in Pennsylvania. So we just have to stay on top of all the different protocols and federal, state, local regulations that are coming out from all these places where we're trying to serve kids.
Yeah, the biggest challenge wearing my hockey hat with so many different organizations, it's not just provincial and regional and municipal, it's also facility driven. Because every
Exactly.
facility, if they're a private facility, they may be a little less than the community-driven facilities. But if you're not adhering to their rules, you can't really run any kind of programming. So it's a lot of work. And I know a lot of people are, as board members in all these different sports groups, are volunteers. And I every time I have an opportunity to interact with them, I give them kudos right out of the gate, saying the amount of work that you've done in the last 12 months has been exponential versus the work that the tireless hours that everybody puts in, even without COVID, and then compound all these regulations and the moving target. That's been a major challenge for a lot of people. So
It's crazy. I mean, the things that I used to worry about, I used to complain about, I look back on now. Like I used to worry about, the rules I'd have during free play time in the gym would be, no half court shots in basketball because, you get a kid playing wall ball with a tennis ball, catches in the back of the head. Now I'm worried about a deadly pandemic and how we're going to keep people safe from that. Just like overnight, our changes and our worries. But, in fairness, I think what's the good part of it is it really has created this, we're all in this together. And I think, man, when kids got together last year and they hadn't had many social experiences with anybody besides maybe their siblings or their cousins, it was magical. Like even break time under the tree and just laughing and giggling. But then when they'd see their friends, I mean, there was just this joy, and parents were so appreciative. They weren't complaining about silly stuff like, how come I ordered a turkey sandwich and my child got a tuna? I mean, it wasn't stuff like, well, I mean, the sort of typical camp director complaints we might get. It was almost all appreciation. It was all thank you for making this happen. Yeah. And, so that's why we in turn are grateful for those schools and municipalities who gave us a chance to deliver on what we were promising. And so we're in a good spot now in that we've got a lot of municipalities and cities who have reached out and say, hey, look, we know you deliver good programming. We have some federal funds based on stimulus money. We have a lot of kids who have been sitting in front of screens, have had no movement. So we're doing, 1,000 kids over 3 weeks in one program here in Hartford, Capital Region Education Council. We have Hartford Magnet Trinity Academy. They've got, a summer school program where we'll do 19 days of 241 programming. We got a K-3 program in New Britain, Connecticut that we're going to be working with for 5 weeks. So we feel really good about the demand for our approach and our capacity to deliver safely again this summer. But it's not going to be without its roadblocks and its challenges for sure.
Yeah, it's going to be continued, just like we are going to have to adapt to return to play when we know what phase we're in, because we had a contingency for phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and we delivered where we'll execute, make sure that we adhere to the cohort model. So same thing, and we're all dealing with it. It's how we deal with it. And the last question I'll ask is, coming out of all of this, the specialization versus multisport, because we've kind of been coming around full circle. Do you see the evolution that we will get back to people recognize the benefits of multisport, or are we going to have these two separate sides of the equation keep going? Because people had a year to kind of reflect, in a sense. Yeah. And are they going to aspire to get their kids more active in more sports because of all the pent up demand, or are we going to keep going down the pathway that we're going in pre-COVID?
Yeah, it's such a loaded question, Glenn. I'd love to say I'm super optimistic that we're going to wake up on the other side of this and we're going to go back to some level of normalcy. But the realist in me conflicts with the idealist. And that's why more and more I'm coming to realize we have to do this community by community, right? Because, when we do summits, you're impacting individuals who then go back to local communities. But to try to create global change without governmental support or without funding or without mandates, it's just really hard to do, because there are business models out there that are going to be conflicting, that are profit driven, that want you to send 80,000 kids to Florida for a volleyball tournament, or that want you to play year-round hockey or lacrosse or field hockey or soccer because their livelihood is dependent on that. I think to create change, I think part of it is you need to recognize that is some people's livelihood. So how do you do and both instead of either or? How do you recognize that, hey, there are opportunities from a business standpoint for folks to work together? Why aren't we forming multi-sport clubs? So, here in the Northeast, soccer is a fall sport, basketball is a winter sport, lacrosse is a spring sport. Why don't 3 of the top clubs put their sort of values where their mouth is and say, hey, why don't we join and make a multi-sport club? We'll still grow each sport. We can profit share. And therefore, we're going to have an opportunity for win-wins, and then have sports sampling programming that happens in the afternoon. But I'm telling you right now, the only way I see this happening for real and long-standing is we got to make our schools our rec centers. I'm sorry. If we don't take advantage of the fact that we have kids, we have a captive audience, and we actually have captive programmers. If we have enough money, believe me, as a young teacher, if you were going to pay me $15 to $25 an hour to stay after school and play with kids, heck yeah, I would have done that. And so if we can fund some of these, really engaging, they don't have to be super sporty or they don't need to know how to coach soccer or teach it. They just need to know how to relate with kids and put them into small-sided games and let the kids figure it out. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, is we think we need to be teaching and instructing all the time. No, we just need to be giving kids a place to play where we're teaching them social awareness. We're teaching them self-regulation. We're teaching them creativity. It's really blending all the stuff we do as counselors with social emotional learning and all the stuff we do with coaches around accountability and creativity, and marrying those things. Well, that can happen at our schools. Let's keep them where they are. Let's send the money there and let them play. That's it. Problem solved.
Yeah, one of the biggest objections I get all the time about why that's not happening is the insurance costs.
Oh, for God's sakes, they're in a public, especially if we're doing it in public schools. And I'll tell you what, most private schools that we work with, that's what they do. They have an intramural sports sampling model. What they've done is, because of lack of field and gym space, what the private schools will do, if they're a 6 through 12 school, is they'll move their intramurals into midday, right after lunch or before lunch. Do your sports sampling in conjunction with lunch, kind of like structured recess, if you will. Mm-hmm. And then it frees up the gyms and the fields for the high school kids after school, while the middle school kids will do their academics up to that point. So I hear you from an insurance standpoint, but if you're running it through the municipality, they're already covered, because you just make it part of that academic process, if you will.
That's, again, the collaboration with municipality, with the school system, and getting everybody on board. So I couldn't agree with you more. We're kind of running out of time, and what I wanted to share, Mark, can you pull up the ticker tape in terms of how people can reach out to Steve and find out about all the different camps that are being run? So 2for1sports.com, I believe you've got them all that are currently posted on the site, right, Steve?
Yeah, all the ones that are open registration are on there. If they are, funded programs like in Philadelphia, Hartford, New Britain, those ones have their own webpage, but they're internal to those schools, so that we don't want people thinking they can just sign up for those, because it's just not the model. So, but yeah, all the other ones that are live are up on the site.
Now, number-wise, how are you comping to last year? Because you said because of all the stimulus funding, there's a lot of kids that are signing up for camps, which we're finding too. We were already at or we've exceeded our number of last year.
Yeah, so across the board, our numbers are up. I mean, I think there's some families who are waiting to sort of see how comfortable they're going to be to visit grandparents that maybe they haven't seen. So any changes there might be, like in Colorado, they're running high school sports all the way through June, but they get out of school in May. So that's having some implications for family travel and what have you. But I'd say across the board, we're going to serve probably 300% more kids than we did last summer.
Wow.
Simply because one of the programs in Hartford is going to be over 1,000 kids alone. I mean, we're that's part of what we're doing right now is, trying to hire staff for all these programs, make sure they're properly trained in our methodology, and so that we can deliver, with quality the way that we have always sort of counted on ourselves being able to do. So, once you take in those numbers of the funded programs, that's almost 1,200 to 1,300 kids alone right there. But our regular camp numbers are they're great. And, certainly one of our missions is to have up to 20% of the kids we serve be kids who otherwise couldn't afford it. And so that's part of what we're doing right now, is trying to reach out to social workers and principals in the area to make sure we're getting kids enrolled who we don't want sitting at home simply because cost is a factor for attending the program.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest pushbacks as kind of a closing statement. Like in Canada, the number that's been shared for years is 1/3 of our kids in Canada can't afford to play any sports. So fortunately, we have a lot of programs like Kids Sport and Jumpstart and Athletic for Kids that are help funding kids play organized sports. But you don't necessarily have to play an organized sport. Intramurals or post-school programming, like you've been plugging, as long as they're active. And those are very, very cost effective. And not only partnering with the school system, but also partnering with the community centers. I think it should be a joint kind of deal where you could go in and make sure that you can provide that programming.
100%. And so this isn't what I'm proposing is not, let's get rid of YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, any other non-for-profits that might be working in these schools. It's let's work in collaboration with them. Let's make sure, because not everybody's going to go home and then go to the Boys and Girls Club. A lot of the effective Boys and Girls Clubs are doing programming right at the schools, and that's what we should be looking at. The other thing, for a program like ours, most of our cost is in customer acquisition. We've got to figure out how to get the word out. How do we market? How do we let people know? And to do that, you have to spend some money. Well, if you tell me, hey, we got 1,000 kids for you, we can lower our costs quite substantially. And it's a win-win for everybody because we don't have to go out and find the kids. It's no expense to the parents. Maybe it's a slight tax increase locally. Who knows? But what you can fund it in different ways. But when I hear stats like that, kids aren't playing sports because they can't afford it. We are absolutely missing the boat if that's how we're doing things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with more. I'm going to wrap up with the last comment. So you said Charlie, so I will use Charles instead of Charles. Steve's earlier point, this is earlier in the conversation. Each of his sons are recruited for sports at the college level. When they talk to college recruiters, each coach liked the fact that his sons were all 3 sport varsity athletes, similar to me, in high school. Big benefits for being cross-trained and not burned out. So that's the big benefit that we've been kind of trying to beat up, touch on for better part of an hour. Agree, disagree, Steve?
Oh, absolutely. I'll never forget when I first started coaching women's lacrosse, met the Dartmouth women's lacrosse coach and told her about my basketball background and how much I love coaching lacrosse. She said to me, she goes, look, I'll tell you right now, at Dartmouth, Division I, pretty high level, she goes, I'll take a top-level basketball player who's never, ever played lacrosse in her whole life over an average lacrosse player, simply because I can teach the things to the basketball player that are the skills of catching and throwing. But I can't teach to that average lacrosse player all the things that high-level basketball player knows. So what she was saying is, we love multi-sport athletes because of all the things that are the intangibles. So to Charlie's point, these are the kids that are, when I said 11 or 12 freshmen and only 3 seniors, I'm telling you right now, it's the multi-sport athletes who last. They're the ones who, they just love to play. They couldn't imagine not playing, right? And so they're the ones that hang in there. So we should probably do a study just to prove that point, but I cannot guarantee you anecdotally that the survivors of those Division I, Division II, Division III programs are coming from a multi-sport background more than a specialist background.
Yeah, well, I'll close it with your, because you're basketball, the NBA. It was a study done by Oakland Children's Hospital, and they looked at former multi-sport NBA athletes versus single sport. Now, single sport is when they decided to specialize in sport at 13 years old when they were starting high school. Yeah. Whereas multi-sport is when they continue to play all the way through till they were a senior in high school. The multi-sport NBA players, according to the study, had a much longer playing career and suffered 10 times less injuries than their single sport counterparts. And I can cite all kinds of data on that one, but we're running out of time. Can't thank you enough, Steve, for doing this. Every time we chat, I learn tons of nuggets, and best wishes to you and Carrie this year for the camp. Sounds like you're seeing some exponential growth. We're really looking forward to running a second camp this year and continue to grow on our side of the pond or up north or however you want to interpret it. and say hi to Carrie. And thank you so much. This is great.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys. Glenn, thanks for being such a champion for what we do, and thanks for hosting me today. It's great to be with you as always.
All right, so it's a wrap. Till next time.